Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura,
And I'm Tom.
and this is episode number 12.
So we're going to be diving into the sports world this week. And Laura, you'll notice that I'm wearing a hat.
Yeah, I don't recognize it though.
So this is a hat from Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And it's got the little Mustang and it's got the D for the city of Dallas. It's
hmm
because today we're talking about SMU and the death penalty, which occurred in the 1980s, and how it really kind of changed college football and college sports forever.
I'm really interested to hear about this.
It's a very interesting topic because as always, it looks at a lot of different things. And for me, there was a big kind of journalism nerd moment in this that I really would love to get into. So to basically start, a little bit of background about SMU. If you're a college football fan, you know SMU. But if you don't, SMU stands for Southern Methodist University. It's a private Christian school in Dallas, Texas. It's a extremely well-to-do school, for lack of a better term. It's in the Dallas neighborhood of Highland Park, which is extremely well off. It's one of the richest. It might be the richest neighborhood in Dallas, and a lot of people of power and influence live there. I can tell you, I visited SMU when I was in high school, and part of the college tour was taking you around the neighborhood and pointing out where all the different athletes live. And when I say athletes, like Troy Aikman lived in Highland Park, Deion Sanders lived in Highland Park. I believe Dirk Nowitzki lived in Highland Park at one point.
Big names
So
there, yeah.
the very big names and very big names in Dallas. So it's a very well-to-do school. For a long time, they've been playing football. Now, SMU had a couple of really kind of golden era periods. SMU kind of gained notoriety in the 20s and 30s for really utilizing the forward pass, and they became very popular. And then the next kind of period of SMU prominence is in the 40s and 50s when they had a player, running back by the name of Doak Walker, who was actually from Highland Park. Doak Walker becomes one of the biggest stars in college football at the time. He's in both the College and Pro Football Hall of Fame now. And at the time, SMU played in the Cotton Bowl in Dallas, which became known as the house that Doak built. After the 50s, SMU goes through a really kind of up and down period in the 60s and early 70s when the team is not really that good. They can't really get good players, and they really kind of fade in the landscape of the city of Dallas. This is also kind of mirrored with the cloud that hung over Dallas for a long time. I don't have to tell you what happened in Dallas in November of 1963. That kind of lingered over the city for a very long time.
Oh, I'm sure.
It wasn't really till the 19 late 1960s, early 70s when the Dallas Cowboys start their kind of run during the 70s, where they gained the moniker of America's team with Roger Staubach and Drew Pearson and Tony Dorsett and all those Hall of Famers, that people don't think of Dallas as the city where John F. Kennedy was assassinated. When they think of Dallas, they think of the Cowboys.
Do you think that was intentional to try what they could to kind of change that reputation and move away from that tragedy?
I mean, I think they were looking for any reason to try and separate themselves from the Kennedy assassination. That being said, what happened with the Cowboys was very organic. They
hmm
just became very good and very popular. It was kind of a confluence of factors under Coach Tom Landry. And so it's as the Cowboys are gaining prominence in the 70s, they hire a scout by the name of Ron Meyer. Ron Meyer is really kind of one of the central stories in the SMU death penalty case. He is at the time a scout. He was the head coach at UNLV, their football program, and he is the salesman of salesmen. He is the type of guy that can sell ice in the wintertime. He can sell a tanning booth in the middle of summer. He is extremely, extremely charismatic. He's extremely, extremely good at selling people on an idea and a vision. and he gets offered the SMU job in the mid 70s, around 1975, 1976, because he saw what could be built there. He saw a university that had kind of been an underappreciated asset in a city that by this time in the mid 70s is growing exponentially. By this point, when he gets hired in 1976 to be SMU's head coach, the school will basically take anybody. They're so down at this point. Basically, they'll take whoever they offer the job to that wants it.
Why do you think that he took the job there knowing that it was such a low level
Because
position?
he wanted to coach, and
Mhm,
he really liked Dallas. By all accounts, he really liked Dallas, and he saw what could be built there.
mhm.
He saw the assets that the school had. He saw the money that the school had, and he saw what could be, and he had a plan on what could be done and really make it into a jewel for college football in Texas. It's at this time when he's hired that the mythology of Dallas is really starting to be built. And it's starting to be built by the massive influx of oil money and just money in general. The city is booming. There's also the national perception of Dallas, which is framed A by the Cowboys and B by the TV show Dallas.
I remember, I
And
mean, I was too young at the time, but just looking at, nostalgia, it
for,
was such a huge show.
pretty much for the people that are under the age of like 40, you can ask older persons and you can tell them that there was a time when the most important question in this country was who shot JR. And that's how big the show was. And the show portrayed Dallas as a city of opulence, as a city of wealth, extravagance. And you hear people who were around Dallas at that time talking about how they saw a lot of the TV show on the streets of Dallas because people in Dallas wanted to portray themselves as what was being shown in the TV show. And so when Ron Meyer steps into this job in 1976, he realizes that he's going to have to do something different to compete. At the time, SMU is in what's called the Southwest Conference. And Southwest Conference can basically be called the good old boy conference. There are 9 schools in the conference at this time, 8 of which are in Texas. The other one is the University of Arkansas. So it's SMU, TCU, which is in Fort Worth, Baylor, which is in Waco, University of Texas, which is in Austin, Texas A&M, which is in College Station, Rice and University of Houston, which are both in Houston, and the University of Arkansas.
So he had no delusions about what he was walking into.
He very did not, and this was a guy who had really kind of fought for everything that was handed to him. He grew up in Indiana to a family that was struggling, to a really kind of a single mom, essentially, and he walks on to Purdue. He was lured there by another great salesman, George Steinbrenner, when George Steinbrenner was a student at Purdue. Basically, he's an overachiever. He overachieves at everything. But when he gets to SMU, he understands that as well off as the school is, as much money is in the school, he also understands that he does not have the resources of public university Texas, like Texas A&M, like the nearby University of Oklahoma, even though they're in a different conference, like the University of Arkansas. These are big state schools that have prestige and have a funding apparatus behind it. These are schools that are also, though, at the same time, pretty highly segregated, even in
Mhm.
the late 60s, early 70s. And so Ron Meyer basically figures out if I'm going to compete, I need to recruit African American athletes. And so when he starts recruiting, he basically builds this machine of recruiting, and he starts recruiting recruiting high school players. He recruits a lot of alumni for private planes so he can go all across the state of Texas and recruit. He devises a plan that he's going to focus on 3 areas. He's going to focus obviously on Dallas, where the school is, in the Dallas Fort Worth area, which is called the Metroplex. He's going to focus on East Texas, and he's going to go into Houston. And specifically, he's going to go into the poorer areas of Houston and recruit African American athletes. It's at this time when he basically enlists a friend by the name of Robin Buttigieg. who basically becomes his conduit and his representative to go into these high schools in Houston and start recruiting black athletes. And they do that by starting to hand out money. And this is how the quote unquote improper recruiting in SMU begins in the 70s. Now, one thing you have to remember, recruiting high school athletes in the state of Texas is extremely competitive because you have a lot of schools, you have a huge pool of talent, and you have a lot of schools fighting for this talent. What SMU had started to do was, quite frankly, not that much different than what other schools were doing at the time. Other schools just didn't get caught. But over time, over the next couple of years, Ron Meyer starts to recruit, and by handing out money, basically, he starts to recruit better and better players. At the time, that's really the only way to get better. That's the only way to compete with the traditional powers, is to recruit better players.
It seems like they were a small fish in a big pond, and they felt that they needed some kind of leg up to compete with that. Am I getting that right?
That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. And so Ron Meyer basically builds this entire apparatus, and he enlists a lot of wealthy boosters. He gets them involved and he gets them interested in the program. And he basically builds this pipeline of wealthy boosters who are going to fund all of this recruiting. One of which is a former SMU player who became very infamous. His name is Sherwood Blunt. And a lot of these guys are independently wealthy. They made their money in oil or real estate, or they give off the air of the stereotypical rich white Texas businessman.
The good old boys.
The good old boy, absolutely. When you have a name like Sherwood Blunt, and over time, over the next couple of years, they start to get better. They start to get better and better and better and better. It's in the 79, like the late 70s, early 80s. They really take off when they recruit two top running backs out of Houston. One is Craig James, who was recruited out of Stratford High School in Houston, not too far from where I went to high school, actually. And the other is a running back by the name of Eric Dickerson out of Sealy, Texas, which is a small town about 40 miles outside of Houston. There's a lot of competition for Eric Dickerson. He was one of the best backs at the time to ever come out of the state of Texas. And there was a lot of intense recruiting for him. As he explained it, the town of Sealy was very much an A&M town. And so there was a lot of pressure for him to go to Texas A&M. So Ron Meyer, he's recruiting him. They're recruiting him. He decides to go to SE, makes a verbal commitment to SMU. So when you're a high school athlete and you commit, there's a verbal commitment that you can get out of, but then there's the written commitment. That's a signed contract.
How far apart are those between the verbal and the written contract?
It used to be that February 1st, usually early February, was the official signing day. So that's when
To start that fall.
to start that fall. And that's
Okay.
when the verbals had to be confirmed written commitments, or that's when the written commitments had to be made official.
They could do a verbal commitment in like the fall before the season before, and then have to have it signed by February, is what you're saying.
Yes. And
Okay.
then also, too, even before then, they could back out. If you
Okay.
have a verbal, they can back out. It's around this time that Eric Dickerson, after he makes his verbal commitment to SMU, starts driving around school in a gold Trans Am. And no one to this day really will say how he got the car. There are SMU people that say A&M tried to bribe him with the car. The SMU people also say that his grandmother was the one who actually signed her name on the title. And then the boosters readily admitted that they helped them with the lease once they got to SMU. Because basically, how you make connections with these families, the other thing you have to remember too is a lot of the times when you're recruiting these athletes, a lot of them are poor. A lot of them are coming from households, from houses that they don't have anything. Sports are their only, athletics, their God-given ability, are the only way they can get a better life for themselves, to provide for their families.
And you see that story like portrayed in TV and movies, that it's like you're riding on, the kid with the sports ability to be able to get into a good college or go pro and make the money for the family. So I feel like you've seen that trope over and over. Yeah.
A lot of these schools capitalize on that. These players make a lot of money. And when I say players, I'm talking about football players, basketball players. But the football and basketball players, a lot of times they're the most visible representatives of your university.
So the school I went to a couple decades ago was definitely their basketball program was definitely the biggest program, brought in a ton of money. The school all rallied around them. And honestly, by the time I left after my 4 years, it slowly started to become a football school as well. Basketball program was still much more popular, but I get you. I couldn't even tell you, who was on their baseball team or anything else, but it was, yeah, definitely those two sports that were the most popular.
And that's what people see the most of. So, you have these athletes that are basically acting as employees of the school, and they're making tons of money and not seeing and at this time not seeing a cent of it. Officially, they're not seeing a cent of it.
And I know we talked a little bit before we started recording, and I know that it's different now, but that was one of the things I was thinking when you told me the topic of this episode. I always had a problem with them not getting paid because you see a lot of these bigger schools, let's say, like Penn State or Ohio State, and they bring in a ton of money because of these players and they don't give them a dime. And it just seems so unfair.
Well, and the other thing too is it's not just, the visibility for the school. They're selling for a long time. They were selling jerseys with just the number on, not the name of the player, but just the number.
Hmm.
Now, if you go to that school and you see a jersey if you go to Michigan, and you see a jersey with a number 9 on it with no name, you're going to know who that is. So it's kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge type of deal where they're not saying who the player is, but you all kind of know who the player is.
Hmm.
And it's just another way that they're making money off of the player,
Exactly. Yeah. And they're getting zero.
and they're getting zero. So what SMU kind of figured out before everyone else did was, if we can show that we will take care of them, and that's giving them anything from a few dollars here and there to cash payments when they needed it, we'll take care of them. That's the type of word of mouth recruiting that gets back to high schools. It gets back to high school coach. And if you kind of gain a reputation of, if you go to SMU, they'll look out for you. They'll take
Mhm.
care of you. They'll take care of your family.
Were there any other in this particular situation, were there any other perks offered to them?
So the rumor always was, always an infamous story that there was a Nissan dealership close to campus, and that basically the entire football team was driving around like the Nissan ZX sports cars
I mean, I
at
feel
the
like it's a
time.
little coincidental that they were all driving a
Yeah, I
Nissan.
mean the story about Eric Dickerson and the Trans Am is kind of legend in Texas, but at the same time, yeah, at the Southwest Conference, again, this was just kind of things that were happening everywhere in the state of Texas. Southwest Conference, there were 9 members. All of them were on probation at some point for recruiting violations. So it's just that kind of fits into the story too, and as we get along later. So it's in 1980 that the team takes a jump, and they jump to a winning record. They go to a bowl. It's after the 80 season that the NCAA hits SMU with its first set of violations. And the violations are not major in nature. Most people call them as kind of ticky tack, players selling the tickets that are given to them, which is not allowed, extra benefits, things that are kind of not huge in the grand scheme of things, but they pile up. And so for the 1981 season, they're hit with a bowl ban and no games on television. 1981 happens to be SMU's best season. They win the Southwest Conference. They are dominant. Dickerson and James are 2 dominant running backs, and they become prominent, and they're nicknamed the Pony Express. And they win the Southwest Conference, and because they couldn't go to a bowl, the players dubbed the last game against Arkansas the Polyester Bowl, because they couldn't go to their actual bowl, which at the time would have been the Cotton Bowl. So instead, they go to the Polyester Bowl, and they beat Arkansas to win the Southwest Conference in 1981.
That's really clever. I like
It
that.
is. I like that. So after the 81 season, Ron Meyer unexpectedly steps down as head coach. Now he ends up taking a job in the NFL with the New England Patriots. as their head coach. And while outward appearances would suggest, and it was a promotion, it was weird timing. Hindsight would kind of suggest that Ron Meyer knew what was coming down the pike because he knew the apparatus that he had built. And so this was him kind of getting out while the getting was good.
Before the shit hit the fan.
Pretty much. So what happens is they end up hiring a coach from Southern Mississippi called named Bobby Collins. He takes over the team, and the team is still successful. In 1982, they actually go undefeated. They win the Southwest Conference again. He controversially does not try to win his last game, but instead plays for a tie. This is back when college football did not have overtime. They only had ties. And because of that, they drop in the polls. At the time, SMU was the number 2 team in the country. If they had won that game, they probably would have played for a national championship. They dropped to 4th instead, and what ends up happening is Penn State wins their first national championship in 1982, beating Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. SMU still was kind of steamed about that. They think that the polls basically cost them a national championship. And they may have been right. There's a lot of what ifs around college football and national championships and claimed national championships in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. There's a very famous story where basically President Nixon in 1970 declares a national champion. That's kind of the weirdness of this sport. It's a wild, wild sport. In the spring of 83, SMU has this big recruiting class. One of the players they recruit is an offensive lineman named Sean Stopbridge. And he is from Pittsburgh. And he had initially given an oral commitment to the University of Pittsburgh, but he changes his commitment and goes to SMU. He was supposed to be a blue chip superstar offensive lineman. Instead, he is injured and just never really plays. And he was never really happy. So he goes back to Pittsburgh. He leaves the program.
Did he finish his 4 years or did he leave early?
He left early.
Okay.
When it became clear he just was never going to play. And the NCAA basically, who was a little fishy about his recruitment, goes to Pittsburgh and talks to him, and they find out that SMU paid him several $1,000s to commit, and they paid his family several $1,000s to commit, moved them down to Dallas, and got the dad a job, all of which are improper recruiting violations. And because of that, SMU gets hit with a real first serious penalty. So when they're investigated in 1985, the NCAA finds that they are not allowed to grant any new football scholarships for the 1985 season. They would only give them 15 for 1986 season. They'd have a 2-year postseason ban, and they would be off of live television in 1986. So that's a big deal.
Seems like some hefty penalties.
That's a hefty penalty. And it's a complete bar from television in 1986. Now, this is a significant penalty, and it's meant to harm the football program. A year where you cannot sign any players, that's a massive penalty. Teams are allowed to sign up to 25 players per recruiting cycle.
I was going to ask, yeah.
A college football roster is usually a lot bigger than a pro football roster. Pro football roster is 53 players and about, I think it's either 43 or 45 actually dress for a game on Sundays. A college football roster will be anywhere from like 80 to 90 players.
Why is it so much more?
Well, if you think about if a player gets hurt in pro football, they can just sign another player, a free agent. You can't really do that in college.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You need enough players that you can withstand injuries.
Gotcha.
So it's after this that the SMU program, which had been running very high from 1980 to 1984, starts to slip. They slip back to kind of 500 middling records in 1985 and 1986. After SMU is sanctioned in 1985, the NCAA basically calls an emergency meeting in New Orleans. Now, this is not specific to SMU, but there had been a rash of recruiting violations that had been uncovered in the decade before from multiple schools. One of the things that are discussed are rules to further punish programs that are caught cheating twice.
So once is fine, but twice.
But twice, yeah.
Yeah.
At that meeting, they create a new rule which is called the repeat violator rule.
Mhm.
If a school had been found guilty of two major violations within 5 years, it could be barred from competing in the sport involved in the second violation for up to 2 years.
Like no games, no nothing?
No games, no nothing. Basically,
Okay.
the program is shut down. It becomes dubbed in the media as the death penalty. To this point, the NCAA had only shut down a season twice in history for any sports, and that was for two basketball teams, Kentucky in 1953 and Southwestern Louisiana basketball from 1973 and 1975. For a case where the death penalty was warranted, the NCAA either would have to enforce the penalty or explain why it didn't have to do so. The rule overwhelmingly passes. SMU, understandably, is one of the 6 schools that vote against the rule. So the school is on probation in 85 and 86. They're almost through the 86 season when the dam finally breaks, and it breaks on a TV report. So a tip comes in to a producer by the name of John Sparks, who's at WFAA TV in Dallas, Channel 8. It's the ABC affiliate. The tip basically leads John Sparks to a player named David Stanley. David Stanley was a linebacker at SMU. He was actually part of the 1983 recruiting class, the same as Sean Stopperidge. And the tip basically is that David Stanley, who by this point was off the team, he did not give the alumni a good feeling about him. He did have issues with alcohol and substance abuse, and he was basically kicked off the team at this point. There's an infamous story in the ESPN documentary about this where Eric Dickerson is meeting David Stanley for dinner at Campese's, which is a famous Italian restaurant in Dallas. It, again, because these things all tie in with each other, it's a restaurant that allegedly had mob ties and that where Jack Ruby had ties to.
Oh, geez.
I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was where Jack Ruby ate the night before he shot Lee Harvey Oswald. These things all tie into each other. Where the issue came in was that this would have meant that they were paying players after they were gone on probation.
Mm.
And this would have been the second violation within 5 years. So WFAA begins to report and fleshes out their reporting. In November of 1986, the report airs, anchored by the longtime sports anchor Dale Hansen. Dale Hansen has kind of gained viral notoriety later in his career, the last couple of years, for his commentaries. He did one on Michael Sam, the first openly gay player, in support of him. He did one about, he's done a bunch of social commentaries that have really been very well done. He did a great social commentary in the wake of the Penn State sexual abuse scandal, talking about how he coped as a survivor of child sexual assault himself and how he survived. He's the one that reports on this story. He's the one that it's like a Dateline piece. He's not doing the actual reporting, but he's the one and asking the questions. And so they interview David Stanley and his mom, and then they interview Bob Hitch, who's the athletic director, Bobby Collins, the head football coach, and the administrative assistant, Henry Lee Parker. And it's Henry Lee Parker who the parents are alleging paid the money in envelopes. The most important thing is when they interviewed the 3 men together, and I tried to find video of the actual piece. I could not find the actual full piece that aired in November 1986, but you can go online, you can find pieces of it. One of the things that Dale Hansen later on says that they didn't know at the time what was in the envelopes. They had David Stanley's and his mom saying that there was cash in the envelopes, but they had no way of proving that.
Mhm.
There was nothing. They didn't have a unsealed envelope. They just had the open envelope that was empty inside. So there was no way to prove what was actually in the envelope.
Right.
But there's a moment in the interview where Dale Hansen asks Henry Lee Parker if he sent David Stanley and his mom anything, any sort of letter, any sort of correspondence, anything. And Henry Lee Parker denies it. It's at that point where Dale Hansen has the envelope, and the envelope has an HLP initialed on the SMU seal for Henry Lee Parker. And he hands him the envelope. And he says, "Is this your letter?"
Is that your letter?
The one in your left hand, really specifically?
The one in the left hand specifically with your initials on the SMU stationery?
That is mine, yes. Did you write it?
Let me get my glasses.
No, this is printed on there, and I do not. You see that? Mm-hmm. It's printed there.
And Henry Lee Parker looks at it, and you could see all the color drain from his face. And first, he's got to reach for the reading glasses. He puts it on. He goes, "Well, yeah, I don't know. This is printed. I don't write like that." They take it to a handwriting analyst who says, beyond a doubt, that's his handwriting on the envelope. They have David Stanley and his mom do a polygraph examination on the air that says they're not lying.
Which, can I just point out, and this has been found over the years, that polygraphs are so unreliable. But
and at this time, they were reliable. Now we know that they are not reliable at all.
I just had to say that. Sorry.
There's a reason why they're no longer admissible. But they asked the handwriting analyst, "Would you go to court with this?" She goes, "I would." Dale Hansen basically says afterwards, when he denied that he sent the letter, we knew we had him. Because all he had to say was, and I'm quoting this word for word from the documentary, all he had to say was, we sent him an insurance form. And we would have had to start all over. Because everything we connected started from the premise of, we knew he sent them something. So when he flat out denied it, we knew we had him.
He sealed his own fate, essentially.
When he sees the envelope, it's an oh shit moment. Because he knows he's fucked, for lack of a better term. At this point, SMU is in panic mode. Internally, they know they're cooked. It's at this point, after that story airs, that things finally fall apart. You find out that there was essentially, for lack of a better term, a slush fund, essentially a payroll. And it was these boosters that were funding the payroll. And that this conspiracy literally goes all the way up to the highest point of the university. It goes all the way up to the Board of Governors, which was headed by Bill Clements, the former, and at the time, current governor of Texas. So the governor of the entire state is in the middle of all this scandal.
Went pretty high up, sounds like.
Went very high up. And by this point, there's a lot of pressure. In late 1986, there's a lot of pressure to stop athletics within the university by professors. And they're meeting about basically how to do damage control on this. And they, first in 1985, there were 9 boosters that are essentially thrown under the bus to try and save the program. And these were the 9 boosters that had basically been the mechanism that Ron Meyer had put together back in the late 70s. This included Sherwood Blunt, George Hunt, and a couple others. And they get branded essentially as the Naughty Nine. And these are the ones that basically were thrown under the bus to try and, as almost as a peace offering to the NCAA, that were cleaning up the program. It's before that they're trying to figure out how to limit the damage. And they tell the boosters, allegedly, that you have to stop paying the players. And Sherwood Blunt says, if you want us to stop, we'll stop, but you boys have to understand, you now have a payroll to meet. This is kind of the catch-22 that they're caught in. They couldn't just unilaterally stop the payments, because then the whistle would have been blown on them earlier. So they had to try and basically phase out the payments.
Do you think that if they stopped it suddenly, that some of the players would have walked?
I think they would have blown the whistle.
Oh, okay, got it.
And I
Okay,
think that's what they were afraid of, is that more would have come out than what originally had come out.
that makes sense. Okay.
And that line, a payroll to meet, that's what eventually the great book by David Whitfield is, who wrote the book that the documentary is based on. That's the name of the book, a payroll to meet. They had to keep going at that point, and they had to just kind of wean out of it, because really they think, and this was another great line from the documentary. When you think you're buying players, really the player is buying you,
Yeah.
because if you cut them off, well, now they're going to go run and talk.
Did they not think about this?
And one of the great themes that really runs through both the book and the documentary is you had people, supposedly really smart people, titans of industry, titans of government, the friggin' governor of the great state of Texas, the governor of Texas, and they're making decisions that are, you want to say to yourself, what the hell are you thinking?
Hmm.
How did you think this was going to work?
Were they all that desperate to make this program work and make it more successful?
They were very desperate to win. You had a lot of people that cared about the program that were really tired of losing. And you have to remember, too, that Dallas was also kind of the hub for all of the Southwest Conference. So you have alums from Texas and Texas A&M and Tech and Texas Tech and Baylor and all these schools. They're kind of all melting together in Dallas. And a lot of them kind of know each other because they're all in the same boardrooms and they're all in the same country clubs and this and that. They're all kind of needling each other and they're all kind of ripping on each other. And I think the really powerful people there got tired of losing, and they were willing to do whatever it took to not have to have a losing football team anymore.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if this school wasn't so wealthy and had wealthy donors and alumni, that I don't think this would have happened. If this was a poor school with, very limited funding, I don't see this happening. Do you?
No, I don't think so. The other thing too, and we'll get to this in a minute, is that they also were not a traditional power. So they didn't have protection that a Texas or an Oklahoma or a USC or any other school that's considered that's, for lack of a better term, a quote unquote blue blood would have had, where they would have had a rapport with the NCAA. They could have probably worked something out. So it's in late 86, early 87 that the NCAA, obviously based on this report, comes and investigates. And SMU basically tries to throw itself under the bus at the mercy of the enforcement committee, where they enforce bowl bans and things of that nature. In fact, the enforcement official essentially praises them for cooperating with the investigation, but it doesn't really matter. In February 1987, the committee votes to cancel their entire 1987 football season. So SMU has the entire football season canceled. They cancel all 4 of their home games in 1988. So SMU decides on its own to cancel the 1988 season. So SMU goes 2 years without fielding a football team.
I honestly feel bad for the kids that couldn't play. You know what I mean? They went to college for this dream of playing football, and then,
Well,
they
what ends up happening too is the NCAA then says that all the kids under scholarship have now essentially been released from scholarship.
Oh,
They can
geez.
sign everywhere and be eligible to play right away. Back in those days, you could only transfer once and you had to sit out a year before you were eligible to play again. Well, now you had 87 Division I caliber football players that could now be eligible to play anywhere else right away.
So my question there is, so their scholarship was pulled at SMU. Did the scholarship transfer to the new school that they were going to? Like, they weren't stuck with a huge tuition bill, were they?
No, so the scholarship just transferred. They just got
Okay.
scholarships in new universities, but basically teams could go and sign however many players they wanted. It was a free agent market, essentially, for football players.
How did the rest of the college football environment respond to that at the time?
They got on planes to Dallas as quickly as they could to snap up whoever they could.
There you go. Yeah.
Basically, one of the ex-coaches says it was like there were deals getting done in parking lots
Hmm.
to sign kids. The penalty was bad enough, but then the depletion rate left them even worse, because during those 2 years they couldn't sign anybody either. So when they finally get back on the field in 1989, first they're only accepting kids that can actually make the university, the academic standards of the university, which cuts into the pool. They're also then just left with whoever didn't get signed by anyone else. So you're left with a extremely depleted roster that can't really compete with what's left around them.
I was gonna say if they were unsigned, then likely they weren't that good.
And that's what ends up happening. The players that are left and the players that come in aren't that good. They have a new coach, and the coach, this second or third game of the season in 1989, they get crushed by Notre Dame, to the point where Notre Dame was actually running out of bounds and taking knees to avoid running up the score. That's how bad it was. One of the ex-players tells a story that, at halftime of the Notre Dame game, the coach goes in and, anyone, trying to fire up the team. I think we can still win this game. And whoever doesn't think we can win this game and beat these guys, you raise your hand. And one player goes up, raises his hand, and goes, "Coach, I don't think we can beat these guys." And that's what it was. And really, what ends up happening is the death penalty really completely destroys SMU well beyond what was really intended, because SMU for a long time never really recovers.
And I get that. I think that they certainly paid consequences for the violations that they did, but as you said, other schools were doing this too to some degree, and then they didn't get, punished or consequences. So I can see both sides of it.
Absolutely. So what ends up happening is they have one winning season over the next 20 years.
Jesus.
Because of their football program being taken away, it throws all the scheduling for the rest of the conference into chaos, because these football schedules for college football are not a year-to-year thing. They're usually made 4 or 5 years in advance.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of schools had to move around games and reschedule games to try and fit the schedule. It's at this time too, when by the time SMU comes back, that the free market forces are starting to affect the Southwest Conference. And you're starting to have a divide between the haves in the conference and the have-nots. So it's in the early 90s, Arkansas leaves and they join the Southeastern Conference. And then in 1995, the rest of the conference dissolves. Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and Baylor merge with another conference and form the Big 12. And the rest of the schools are kind of left to wander the wilderness. So SMU is then out of big-time football. They're in kind of smaller conferences playing smaller schools, and they struggle for a very long time. It's really not until the last decade, 15 years or so, that they start having some success again, up until where they bounce around in smaller conferences and have success. In I believe it's 2018 or 2019, they're finally ranked in the top 25 poll for the first time since the early 80s. And then this year, they actually finally got an invitation to get back into a major conference. And that's part of a whole nother story in terms of how TV money has completely changed the sport and changed college sports forever. That's a whole nother story for a whole nother day. Basically, the death penalty worked too well, and it robbed their ability to compete for 2 decades that they're just now starting to recover. It really drove the NCAA to determine that this was too harsh of a penalty. It's never been given out before, and it's never been given out since.
Do you think that other colleges learn from this, either to not do it or do it better?
Yes and yes, because, like, for example, as you know, we're recording this in October of 2023. Right now, the University of Michigan, which has long held itself out as kind of being the standard bearer of doing things the right way, and that they're above everyone else, and they're the morals police and things like that. They're under investigation right now for Spygate, essentially, for using video cameras and an ex-Marine to basically spy on other teams
Oh,
and
good.
steal their signs. Now, that's a whole other discussion in itself because the guy basically bragged about it on LinkedIn.
The stupidity sometimes, I
Well, yeah,
swear.
and the stupidity and the arrogance.
Yeah, the arrogance.
Um, the one thing you learn about college sports is no one's really clean in all this. Everyone has skeletons in the closet.
You mentioned that, and again, something we talked about briefly before we started recording. So we both know very well about the Penn State sexual abuse scandal. You mentioned it a little while ago. So my thoughts are, and again, this is apples and oranges, and I understand that. But I think that when you look at this and you say, okay, some players were given a couple $1,000s, a couple $100 versus this huge sexual abuse scandal that was covered up for years and years and years, two very different things, two very different severities. And I think, like you said, Penn State didn't really get the death penalty. I know they served some consequences for that, maybe a year or so. You can tell me a little bit better, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem the punishment doesn't seem to fit the crime for the SMU versus what Penn State got. But
Well, and it's not even just Penn State too. Baylor football program basically was covering up rapes,
oh god,
sexual assaults of their football players, covering it up to win football games.
and tell me
Eh,
they didn't get anything like this, right?
Nothing close to this.
No.
And I should also tell you that one of the heads of the university at that time was Kenneth Starr.
Oh god,
Yes, that Kenneth Starr,
the Kenneth Star.
the Kenneth Starr.
But I mean,
So
I think you would agree that it's just not. It's not fair.
when you ask a lot of people about this, they'll say it was horrible. Something had to be done about it at the time, because what they were doing was so out in the open and they were so brazen, they were so arrogant about it that they needed to be something had to be done. And eventually you can only just punish them so many times before you have to just bring the hammer down.
Like you said, I think they were trying to set an example here with this team. But again, was it the appropriate level of response?
And the other thing too is that, in the 30 years since this, the attitudes about the NCAA as an enforcement body have changed as well. Whereas back then they were something to really be feared, or the aura and the reputation of them as something to be feared has really kind of been dissipated to the point where they have been revealed to be nothing more really than mall cops, with no real legal authority, that they don't wield kind of the power that, say, like an FBI does, even though they like to portray themselves as having that. And really, it's found to be nothing more than self-serving in order to protect their interests and the interests of universities that like things the way they are because they make a lot of money off of it. And again, we can get into a whole different discussion about how some of the unethical things the NCAA has done when they are extremely motivated to make sure a case kind of leans a certain way to protect certain interests. The tenor around that has changed. The other part of it too is now the NCAA has allowed players some sort of agency, through something called name, image, and likeness rights, meaning that players can get paid for using their name, image, and likeness. So now these players do have a official revenue stream.
How much in general ballpark do you think that is per year per player?
It really depends. It
Mhm.
depends on the school. It depends on the program. It depends on the caliber of players. Some schools, the apparatus is a lot more organized. Other schools, it's not. The schools where it is more organized, they tend to be able to draw better players and keep them there. There was a really, and I'm just kind of using the Cliff Notes version here. I believe it was last year. There was a very highly touted quarterback who had originally committed to go to, I believe it was the University of Florida, because promises were made to him in terms of name, image, and likeness compensation, and the apparatus that was completely disjointed, the deal fell through, and he ended up not going to Florida. He ended up going to Arizona State instead. It really depends on the school, and it depends on the program. It depends on how aligned the apparatus are in order to get things done.
So I have two questions about that. So one, when they make these offers about the image and likeness compensation, I'm wondering if the colleges are competitive in that way, saying like, we can offer you 10,000, we can offer you 15,000. That's my first question. And my second question is like, how do they set the budget for that? Is it like a certain percentage of the revenue that the football program brings in? Like how do they determine that?
A lot of these NILs are independently funded by
By okay.
donors and boosters.
You would alumni usually?
Alumni, usually alumni, but it could be alumni, could be corporations.
Mhm.
So they're the ones that are funding this, not the schools. And I think a lot of that's probably done on purpose so the schools can kind of go, we don't see it. It didn't, it doesn't
Yeah.
happen.
But that's
So
again, that's unfair to me too. That you know what I mean? Because the alumni are one thing. I get that because you have ties to the school. But these corporations, do you just pick and choose which programs they want to donate to? That's a little and I'm sure
it's
there's not a ton of regulation around that either.
it's very messy, very messy. And I
Sounds
think
messy.
I think you can probably make a very interesting case study about whether what SMU did would be as big of a deal today, knowing what we know now about the NCAA, knowing what we know now about NIL, knowing what we know now about what the national perception is and what the national feeling is about paying collegiate athletes.
So that was my other question. Are colleges competitive saying like I can offer you 10 grand versus 15 grand or
So a lot of this used to be done in the shadows, and that's
Mhm.
where you would basically have, for lack of a better term, bagmen, who were basically funding these things. And I don't, if you ever get a chance to, if you want to kind of see the inner workings of how this all works, first go see the SMU ESPN SMU 30 for 30 called Pony Excess. Read the book that's based on a payroll to meet, and then the other thing is go watch Stephen Godfrey's documentary about this happening at his alma mater, University of Mississippi, called I think it's Fair Play, and to see kind of the whole kind of seedy underbelly of how this works and how the NCAA investigations work is extremely interesting. Really, what it comes down to is it really just kind of depends. It,
Depends on how good the player is, how many colleges want them.
exactly. The
Yeah.
better the player is, the more it's going to drive up the price. The
Mhm.
players have agency for the first time ever at this level, and they're going to use it.
Is anybody looking out for these kids? Is there anybody representing them? Like
So, and
how
that's the other thing too, is that when you're a collegiate athlete, you're not allowed to have an agent.
So no, essentially. No.
So once you have an agent, you lose your eligibility as an
Ugh.
amateur.
And that's by design.
Basically, people have openly admitted, the guy who created the term student athlete openly admitted that he created that term just so that universities could get out of workers' compensation laws. So they wouldn't have to, pay workers' compensation benefits to athletes as employees, even though they are essentially employees of the university.
And even though these schools the bigger schools rake in millions of dollars with tuitions through the roof. This is it's so gross.
Tuitions, with sponsorships, with TV deals, and these are the kind of little cat and mouse. And the NCAA has let this go on for, again, I could do a whole other episode about TV money in college football and how it's completely changed the sport.
It's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
welcome to college football, Laura.
Ugh, I don't like it.
The games are really fun. The rest of it is a lot of bullshit.
But again, too, not related to this, but you can also go into the dangerousness this is for college kids and the concussions and the injuries. And I mean, that's a whole nother ball of wax. So,
Well, and basically, that's not even getting into the part where you have these coaches who treat these players like meat. They run them into the ground, and if they get hurt, well, then, sucks to be them.
these players are dispensable.
Yeah. And meanwhile, it's one thing for the universities to get money. The coaches are getting rich.
Mhm.
The coaches have, they may have a base salary of $3 to $4 million a year, plus the deals they have with Nike or Adidas or whoever, does the uniforms or all the gear for the schools.
They must get a cut of the endorsement deals.
They
Yeah.
get that. They do have their own private endorsements for whatever companies. They also will have their own, they get paid to do their own coaches shows every week during the season. So, and a lot of these schools, especially at the public schools, you can look this up. A lot of times the highest paid public employee in in the state is the college football, the college basketball coach.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Meanwhile, you have the players that are actually doing the labor are not earning a cent officially.
And I think it's different too than pro football because you have this athlete for 4 years, right? And you can run them hard and you can, essentially beat them up and they move on. Either they, make it pro or they don't or whatever. Where I think it's different in pro because a lot of them do want to become big names and you want to hold on to those big names and the big talent and you want to keep them for years and years and years if you can. So I see where they really say that they're dispensable at this level.
Well, and the other thing too is that, if you're a pro football player, that's your job.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
So, it's a profession like any other profession. You have to put in work. Like any other profession, you have a right to be fairly compensated for your work. Where it gets very muddy and very messy with college is you have coaches that are demanding basically a pro athlete type of job description and doing it on top of going to class.
Well, I mean, thinking about my college experience and like I said, the basketball team was very popular at my school. They were certainly held to a lower standard than the rest of us were held to. And I remember them, not showing up to most classes and just passing anyway. So yeah, it's a little different.
I listen, it is a little different. I know there are some athletes that absolutely put in a lot of work.
I'm sure some of them
Um,
do. Yeah.
but again, you're doing all this in a 24-hour day, and you're also expected to perform to the best of your ability. And oh, by the way, your quote unquote benefit for this is a hearty handshake and an attaboy, and that you're doing it for the love of the game.
Yeah. And you likely won't make pro. So
Exactly. So
yeah.
that's really, we can do a whole episode just on that.
And I think too, not only all of that, but to add in like 18 to 22, you remember, it's a very difficult time for anybody. And especially in college, you're on your own for the first time. There's a lot of pressure. And I think just adding that, being a part of this, college sport too, that just adds just another layer to that, to their life, which I mean, that can't be easy.
No, it's not. And like I said, it's not. It's not. And it's a whole sordid state of affairs. And quite frankly, and you guys can let us know in the comments, if this happened today, what would you think would happen? Because I think it would be very, very different than what it was back in 1986.
And like I said, I think, again, just given the response to something like the Penn State scandal, I think this would have been a story for a couple days, talked about, and then just moved on. They wouldn't really receive anything. And that's, again, I think that, like I said before, I don't think this deserved the punishment or the consequences that they got, especially, again, you're just giving these kids some money. Like that's, it's
Exa-
not the serious as of, a Penn State or a Baylor or you know what I mean?
I wouldn't have done it either.
Yeah.
I would have, but then again, I also look at this as these kids are employees of the school.
Essentially, yeah.
Essentially. So, but again, let us know what you guys think, and let us know on our TikTok or our Instagram. Let us know what you think in our Gmail. We'd love to hear from you. Paying players is good.
Yes, it is. And they, like we said, they definitely deserve more.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. So that's our show. So I do want to say one thing before we close out. Just want to thank everybody for the wonderful response that we got to our Halloween episode. A lot of people seem to enjoy it. A lot of people enjoyed our TikTok video about it. So just thank you. If you haven't checked that out, please do. I think it turned out really well.
I think so too. And again, I remind you, if you summon Michael Keaton, compliment his Batman. He's done so much for us. That's the least you can do for him.
This shit again? Are you kidding me?
What has Michael Keaton ever done to you, Laura? What's the one with Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze?
Oh God. It might be Batman Forever. Yeah, that was rough.
That thing needs to be yeeted into the sun.
That we agree on. All right, look at that. Okay, guys, so tune in next week for another episode. So, next week, I am going to cover game show scandals. So, I'm doing my research now and I found some really, really interesting things. So, I'm really excited to cover that next week. If you enjoy our show, please give us a 5-star review, subscribe, and follow us on social media at the Tell Me About Podcast, and send us comments and episode suggestions to the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. See you next week, everybody.
Bye.